When Maria del Garnier left Montmartre on September the 16th, 1876, she left as a woman physically broken, mentally drained, but spiritually determined. For her, it was not a question of if she would return to Montmartre, but more importantly, when she would return to Montmartre. Her first priority was to regain her strength and health. She would live out these years as someone who is living in a dark tunnel, following a pinprick of light that gradually becomes greater and greater, until 22 years later, she fully emerges from that dark tunnel to glorious daylight at Montmartre with a small group of followers united in one cause, the adoration of the Holy Eucharist at Montmartre. Montmartre, towards the end of the 1800s, was a very vibrant place. It was noted for its cafes and its restaurants, which attracted many people to the area. It also attracted beggars and prostitutes and street hawkers, and also street artists. Art was a very famous theme at Montmartre. Many famous artists actually visited Montmartre, and they include Renoir, Degas, Monet, Picasso, and we mustn't forget the diminutive Toulouse-Lautrec. And it was into the melting pot of all this colour and culture that Maria del Garnier, as an instrument in God's hand, made the presence of Jesus Christ present to all. The next 22 years were to be 22 years of recovery, which never saw Maria del Garnier regain her full health. She drifted between having enough strength to do basic things and being in a state of total helplessness. It is a period where there are no great events in her life. All the major changes take place beneath the surface. She is being forged in the fire to be shaped by God's anvil and hammer. She returned in that September of 1876 to Dijon to be with her father and sister. In March the following year, she visits the spa at Alais-Saint-Reine in the Côte d'Or. There is no improvement in her condition. A friend then encourages her to go to the newly founded shrine at Lourdes. It takes Maria del Garnier 9 days to get there, where she bathes in the water. She feels stronger, so much so that it only takes 4 days to return to Dijon. She then spends a little time in Dijon before deciding to join Josephine at Bruth in Brittany. She spent some time there in a care home and was very happy there, particularly as her room was right by the chapel. She stayed there until 1881, which was a lot longer than she expected, but was caused by the visit of a very dear friend. She returned to Dijon, where the family had gathered for the first time in 10 years. It was 1881, and it was a gathering that was marked by the deathbed conversion of her father. She stayed at Dijon until 1892, but ill health forced her to live in the country, and she returned to Alais-Saint-Reine with her sisters Josephine and Marie because of the bracing air there, before they settled in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, where they went for their schooling after her mother died. As part of this formation and preparation, Jesus Christ gifted Maria del Garnier with a most extraordinary vision. It was a vision that was to define the rest of her life. It took place in the Cathedral of Saint-Bernard in Dijon. A few years earlier, after the death of her father, the family had moved in Dijon and were now closer to the cathedral. This blissful experience took place in November 1888, when Marie Adele was at Mass. In her own words, I will relate what she saw as she recorded the event in a letter to Abbé Courtois dated the 23rd of November 1888. At the moment that the priest took the particle of the host which he had to place in the chalice, I raised my eyes to adore the particle as I normally do. But what amazement, for I saw this particle completely and entirely blood red. Its colour was bright and rich, like fresh blood and vermilion. It was at the same time luminous, and furthermore, the index finger which was holding the particle was lightly reddened and moist with blood on the small area around the edge of the particle, which had the shape rather like a triangle. My gaze stayed for a few seconds, fixed upon this marvel, for I was so extraordinarily amazed that I was as if petrified. For Marie Adele Garnier, this vision brought together the two most important elements in her life: sacrifice and adoration. She was still 10 years from establishing her own group of adorers. We can only imagine how much inspiration and encouragement she would have received from this vision. Now, the period between leaving Montmartre and returning is a time when Marie Adele's suffering led her to a belief that went to the core of her being. She had always considered herself a martyr for Christ. Her sufferings now took her a stage further. So intense were these sufferings, and so close did she feel united to Christ, that she began to see her life as a mystical espousal or betrothal to Christ. In her memoirs, she speaks of Christ as being a willing partner in this union. Furthermore, it was at this time, on the 17th of June 1885, that Marie Adele Garnier made her vow of total abandonment to the will of God. During all this period, Père Chamberlain, who was her spiritual director, was forced to leave France because of an interdict against the Jesuits. Marie Adele Garnier kept in touch with him by correspondence. Not long after his departure, she made the acquaintance of a certain Abbé Courtois in 1885, who was the chaplain to the Carmelite convent at Dijon. When he first met Marie Adele Garnier, he asked her to write down all the graces that she had received during her lifetime. Marie Adele Garnier and Abbé Courtois were to form a lasting friendship which spanned 7 years and gave rise to a lot of correspondence which is now to be found in the archives of the Tyburn Mother House. Furthermore, and not much later, she met with Abbé Charles Sauvé, who had written many spiritual books. Slowly but surely, and with the advantage of hindsight, a plan was beginning to emerge. A pathway showing the way forward was becoming visible. Marie Adele's life, in one sense, was no different to anybody else's. So many things were happening at the same time. There were lots of moving parts. Among all the ups and downs, though, that happened to her in this period, Marie Adele's heart and mind were always on Montmartre and her desire to return there. In spite of relapses, her health was getting stronger. Spiritually, she was ready for anything that God would ask her to bear. After her experiences as a recluse at Montmartre 20 years before, Marie Adele knew that she could not do this alone. She realized that she would need at least 3 to start the adoration at Montmartre. This would be the last piece of the jigsaw to make the picture complete. Unbeknown to others who were to take part in the strategy, like moving pieces on a chessboard, God was setting the scene for Maria del Garnier. There were some young pious ladies that were known to her, whom she hoped would join her. Indeed, one of them, Maria del, thought possessed all the qualities needed to lead. However, as often happens in life, hopes turned to disappointments, and none of these ladies came to her. It was 1896. Maria del Garnier was 58 years old, when most people at the time believed that their best years were behind them. A young lady of 23 years entered into her life. Nobody could have imagined just how close these two were to become over the next 28 years. The young lady's name was Alice Andrade. Alice Andrade was born on January the 20th, 1873. Her mother, who was English, died shortly after her birth. Not only was Alice's mother English, but she was also a Protestant, and out of deference to her mother, Alice was brought up as a Protestant. Not long after her mother's death, Alice's father married again, and this time to an American Catholic. His new wife became a true mother to the little Alice, and in the following years the family was enlarged by 3 sons and 2 daughters. At the age of 16, with her father's approval, Alice became a Catholic. When she looked back at this time of her life, she will admit that she always felt a Catholic. The Catholic faith obviously played an important role in the life of the Andrades. When Michel Andrade, her father, died, the family moved to Paris. Both Alice and her stepmother placed themselves under the direction of a saintly Dominican, Père Balme. Père Balme was to prove very helpful to Maria del Garnier and her nascent congregation. Alice took her faith very seriously, and believing that God was calling her to the religious life, for a short time she tested her vocation with the Dominicans, leaving when she believed that it was not where God wanted her to be. Alice felt strangely drawn to a new religious order, but she did not know of any. Alice kept all this to herself. Now, Providence has a unique way of threading together the threads of our lives so that God's plan can come into effect. Michel Andrade, Alice's father, was a good friend of Victor Garnier, Adèle's brother. Josephine Garnier, Adèle's sister, visited Paris on one occasion in 1896 and stayed with the Andrade family. Josephine Garnier and Alice became very good friends, so much so that Alice felt that she could confide in Josephine and explain that she was not looking to get married, but to join a new religious order. You can imagine Josephine's reaction and turning to Alice and saying, "You should talk to my sister then." That night, an excited Josephine wrote to her sister, Maria del, saying, "If it is God's will that you should begin this foundation, I think that I have found your first companion." The Garnier family at that time were living in Villeneuve-sur-Yonne, and that summer the Andrades also went there. When they met each other, Maria del and Alice immediately bonded. The nature of the affection between them was very much that of a mother and daughter. They were destined to be together for the next 28 years with very little time apart. Alice was to prove to be a pillar of support and the utmost faithful companion to Marie Adele in the trials and difficulties of the years ahead. Marie Adele, in her memoirs, referred to Alice Andrade as the other half of myself. Divine providence had provided. We have all experienced a situation where we have waited ages for a bus and then 2 or 3 come along at the same time. Sometimes vocations can be a bit like that. It is 1897 and the year started with great disappointment for Marie Adele. The one outstanding person that she really hoped would join her did not. This was disappointing for Marie Adele on 2 counts. First, it would have given her all 3 persons she required to begin her small congregation. And secondly, so highly did Marie Adele Garnier think of this person and the role she would play, that Marie Adele saw her as the foundress of the congregation. Marie Adele was disappointed, but not downhearted. However, along came another bus. The clouds opened and the sun shone, and Marie Adele had her 3rd member. Her name was Alice Bourgeois, 18 years old. She was about to enter a religious congregation at Lourdes, but had heard of Marie Adele's work and was very attracted to it. Strange though it may seem, in her writings Marie Adele recalls some time earlier kneeling beside Alexida when they were receiving communion, both strangers to each other. Marie Adele felt a great sense of awareness of Alexida Bourgeois. Marie Adele felt that one day this young lady kneeling beside me would be my daughter. Soon afterwards they met each other at the house of a mutual friend, a Mademoiselle Villon, where Marie Adele revealed her hopes, plans and aspirations. Alexida Bourgeois was hooked. Marie Adele now had her 3 members, and it was decided that they would start at Montmartre in June that year. It should be mentioned that, shall we say, the 3 wise men at the time, Abbé Courtois, Abbé Sauvé and Père Balme, were very convinced that Marie Adele Garnier was being led by God. Even though still 1 member short, they went ahead and put together the rule for this new congregation. Père Balme already had experience in setting up this new congregation, and his experience proved invaluable. The process of canonical recognition of this new congregation started before the congregation existed. It should also be pointed out that the first 3 members of the congregation, founded by Marie Adele Garnier, all felt the call to the religious life. All tested their vocation of the religious life at other religious institutes. All left these institutes feeling that it was not where God wanted them to be. When they met Marie Adele Garnier, they felt that this was where God wanted them to be. On June the 21st, 1897, 2 women took up residence at number 11A, Rue de Montcenis, very close to the site of the Basilica. They were Marie Adele Garnier and Alice Andrade. The little lady in black had returned to Montmartre. The next day they were joined by Alexida Bourgeois, and the following day, on the recommendation of Abbé Sauvé, they were joined by another, a widow from the Côte d'Or, who was to become known as Sister Thérèse. Their first monastery consisted of 2 little bedrooms, a sitting room which served as an oratory, refectory, community room and a parlour. The small dressing room which was there was the first cell of the congregation. The premises also had a tiny kitchen. Several months later, they had the use of a garret at the top of the building. The first monastery was poorly furnished, and as before, they called their monastery Nazareth. Alessandra recalls in the early days living there, Maria Del took her to the oratory and they prayed a prayer that she never forgot. They prayed for the grace that they may always be poor. Such was the joy and excitement of the new residents that they could see no shortcomings or deficiencies in their new residence. They took with them only what was strictly necessary and a few fold-up beds for the future postulants. They followed the rule as put together by Père Balme and Maria del Garnier. But their first days were like a catacomb existence. It was agreed that they would keep themselves to themselves for a period of 6 months as a means of testing their vocation prior to canonical recognition. Besides preparing the rule for them to follow, Père Balme also prepared them a sort of religious habit, which was a scapular that they wore under their clothing. They were also given their religious name, and to that name was added the name of Mary, our Blessed Lady, a tradition which continues in the congregation to this very day. Maria del Garnier had placed the congregation under the protection of St. Michael. It was difficult to keep their existence from the priests at the Basilica. Eventually, Abbé Sauvé had to go and speak to the superior of the community there and explain what was happening. The name of the superior was Père Jean-Baptiste Lemieux. Immediately he went to see Maria del Garnier. She left so deep a impression on him that for the next 15 years he proved a true friend to the new congregation. Much of the early days was spent by Maria del Garnier and her advisors into compiling the necessary documentation for the canonical recognition of this new congregation. On the 4th of March 1898, Père Lemieux, because of Abbé Sauvé's ill health, presented the relevant documentation and explained this new congregation to Cardinal Richard. Immediately, Cardinal Richard canonically recognized the new congregation. The new members could now officially start their novitiate. The Society of the Sacred Heart of Montmartre was born, giving cause for many Te Deums and great rejoicing. They were also known as the Sisters of the National Vow. During that busy year, several postulants and benefactors began to appear. One of these benefactors was Madame Le Gentil, whose husband was the instigator of the national vow to the Sacred Heart almost 30 years earlier.